Chapter 2, The Rashness of the King. About 3 weeks later, the last of the kings of Narnia sat under the great oak which grew beside the door of his little hunting lodge, where he often stayed for 10 days or so in the pleasant spring weather. It was a low, thatched building, not far from the eastern end of Lantern Waste and some way above the meeting of the two rivers. He loved to live there simply and at ease, away from the state and pomp of Caer-Paravel, the royal city. His name was King Cherian, and he was between 20 and 25 years old. His shoulders were already broad and strong, and his limbs full of hard muscle, but his beard was still scanty. He had blue eyes and a fearless, honest face. There was no one with him that spring morning except his dearest friend, Jewel the unicorn. They loved each other like brothers, and each had saved the other's life in the wars. The lordly beast stood close beside the king's chair, and with its neck bent round, polishing its blue horn against the creamy whiteness of his flank. "I cannot see myself to any work or sport today, Jewel," said the king. "I can think of nothing but this wonderful news. Thank you, we shall hear more of it today." "They are the most wonderful tidings ever heard in our days or our fathers," said our grandfather's day. "Sire," said Jewel, "if they are true." How can they choose but be true?" said the king. "It is more than a week ago that the first birds came flying over us saying, 'Aslan is here. Aslan has come to Narnia again.' And after that, it was the squirrels. They had not seen him, but they said it was certain that he was in the woods. Then came the stag. He said he had seen him with his own eyes a great way off by the moonlight at Lantern Waste. And then came that dark man with the beard, the merchant from Colorman. The Colmarines cared nothing for Aslan as we do, but the man spoke of it as a thing beyond doubt. And there was the badger last night. He too said he had seen Aslan." "Indeed, sire," answered Jewel, "I believe it all. If I seem not to, it's only that my joy is too great to let my belief settle itself. It's almost too beautiful to believe." "Yes," said the king with a great sigh, almost a shiver of delight. "It is beyond all that I ever hoped for in my life." "Listen," said Jewel, putting his head at one side of the cocking his ears forward. "What is it?" said the king. "Hooves, sire," said Jewel. "A galloping horse, a very heavy horse. It must be one of the centaurs. And look, there he is." A great golden bearded centaur with man's sweat on his forehead and horse's sweat on his chestnut flanks dashed up to the king, stopped and bowed. "Hail, king!" it cried in a voice as deep as a bull's. "Ho there," said the king, looking over his shoulder toward the door of the hunting lodge. "A bowl of wine for the noble centaur. Welcome, Runwit. Where have you found your breath? When you have found your breath, you shall tell us your errand." A page came out of the house carrying a great wooden bowl, curiously carved, and handed it to the centaur. The centaur raised the bowl and said, "I drink first to Aslan." "In truth, sire, and secondly to your majesty." He finished the wine, enough for 6 strong men and 1 draught, and handed the empty bowl back to the page. "Now, Runwit," said the king, "do you bring us more news of Aslan?" Runwit looked very grave, frowning a little. "Sire," he said, "you should know how long I've lived and studied the stars, for we centaurs live longer than you men, and even longer than your kind, unicorn. Never in all of my days have I seen such terrible things written in the skies as there have been nightly since this year began." "The stars say nothing of the coming of Aslan, not of peace nor of joy. I know by my art that there have not been such disastrous conjunctions of the planets in 500 years. It was already in my mind to come and warn your majesty that some great evil hangs over Narnia, but last night the rumor reached me that Aslan is abroad in Narnia. Sire, do not believe this tale. It cannot be. The stars never lie, but men and beasts do. If Aslan were really coming to Narnia, the sky would have foretold it. If it were really come, all the most gracious stars would be assembled in his honor. I'm sorry, it's all a lie. A lie, said the king fiercely. What creature in Narnia or in all the world would dare lie on such a matter? And without knowing it, he laid his hands on his sword hilt. That I know not, Lord King, said the centaur, but I know there are liars on earth, and there are none among the stars. I wonder, said Jewel, whether Aslan might not come through, though all the stars foretold otherwise. He is not the slave of the stars, but he is their maker. And it is not said in all of the old stories that he is not a tame lion. Well said, Jewel, cried the king. Those are the very words, not a tame lion. It comes in many tales. Runwit had just raised his hand and was leaning forward to say something very earnestly to the king when all three of them turned their heads and listened to a wailing sound that was coming quickly, drawing nearer. The wood was so thick to the west of them they could not see the newcomer yet, but they could soon hear the words. Woe, 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 called the voice. Woe for all my brothers and sisters. Woe for the holy trees. Woe for the land waste. The axe is loosed against us. We are being felled. Great trees are falling. With the last falling, the speaker came up into sight. She was like a woman, but she was so tall that her head was on the level with the centaurs, yet she was like a tree too. It's hard to explain if you've never seen a dryad, but quite unmistakable once you have. Something different in the color, the voice, the hair. King Trinian and two of the beasts knew at once that she was the nymph of the beech tree. Justice, Lord King, she cried, come to our aid, protect your people. They are felling us in Lantern Waste. Very great trunks to my brothers and sisters are already in the ground. What, lady? Felling of Lantern Waste? Murdering the talking trees, cried the king, leaping to his feet and drawing his sword. How dare they? And who dares it? Now, by the mane of Aslan. Gulped the dryad, shuddering, as if in pain, shuddering time after time, and as if it responded to heavy blows. There, all at once, she fell sideways, and suddenly, as if both her feet had been cut from under her, for a second, they saw her lying dead on the grass, and then she vanished. They knew what had happened. Her tree, made miles away, had been cut down. For a moment, the king's grief and anger were so great that he could not speak. Then he said, come, my friends, we must go up to the river and find the villains who have done this, and with all great speed we may, and because will not leave one of them alive. Sire, with a good will, said Jewel. But Runwit said, Sire, be wary in your just wrath. There are strange doings afoot. If there should be rebels in arms further up the valley, we three are too few to meet them. If it would please you to wait a while, I will not wait 1/10 part of a second, said the king. But while Jewel and I go forward, do you do you gallop as hard as you may up to Cair Paravel. Here is my ring for your token. Give me a score of men-at-arms, all well-mounted, and a score of talking dogs, and 10 dwarfs. Let them be full of archers, and a leopard or so, and Stonefoot the giant. Bring all of these after us as quickly as can be. With a good will, sire, said Runewit, and at once he turned and galloped eastward down the valley. The king strode on at a great pace, sometimes muttering to himself and sometimes clenching his fists. Jewel walked beside him, saying nothing, so there was no sound between them but the faint jingle of rich gold chain that hung around the unicorn's neck and the noise of 2 feet and 4 hooves. They soon reached the river and turned up it where there was a grassy road. They had the water on their left and the forest on their right. Soon after that, they came to a place where the ground grew rougher and thicker wood came down to the water's edge. The road, what there was of it, now ran on the southern bank, and they had to follow the river to reach it. It was up to Tyrion's armpits, but Jewel, who had 4 legs and was therefore steadier, kept on his right so as to break the force of the current, and Tyrion put his strong arm around the unicorn's strong neck, and they both got safely over. The king was still angry that he hardly noticed that cold of the water, but of course he dried his sword very carefully on his shoulder of his cloak, which was the only dry part of him, as soon as they came to shore. They were now going westward with the river, and on their right was Lantern Waste straight ahead of them. They had not gone more than a mile when they both stopped and both spoke at the same moment. The king said, "What have we here?" And Jewel said, "Look." "It's a raft," said King Tyrion. And so it was. 6 splendid 3 trunks, all new cut and newly lopped off of their branches, had been lashed together to make a raft, and they were gliding swiftly down the river. On the front of the raft, there was a water rat with a pole to steer it. "Hey, water rat, what are you about?" cried the king. "Taking legs down to sell to the Calamores, sire," said the rat, touching his ear as he might have done with his cap if he'd had one. What do you think? "Telomeres," thundered Tyrion. "What do you mean? Who gave the order for these trees to be felled?" The river flows so swiftly at the time of the year that the raft had already glided past the king and Jewel, but the water rat looked back over his shoulder and shouted out, "The lion's orders, sire! Aslan himself!" He added something more, but they couldn't hear it. The king and the unicorn stared at one another, and both looked more frightened than they had ever been in any battle. "Aslan," said the king at last, in a very low voice. "Aslan, could it be true? Could it be? Could he be felling the holy trees and murdering the dryads? Unless the dryads have all done something dreadfully wrong," murmured Jewel. "But selling them to the Calamores," said the king. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," said Jewel miserably. "He's not a tame lion." "Well," said the king at last, "we must go on and make the adventure that comes up to us." "It's the only thing left for us to do, sire," said the unicorn. He did not see at the moment how foolish it was for the 2 of them to go on alone, nor did the king. They were too angry to think clearly, but much evil came out of their rashness in the end. What do you think? Should he be doing this? Suddenly the king leaned hard on his friend's neck and bowed his head. "Jewel," he said, "what lies before us? The Horrible thoughts arose in my heart. If we had died before today, we should have died and happy. Yes, said Jewel, we have lived too long. The worst thing in the world has come upon us. They stood out like that for a couple of minutes and then went on. Before long, they could hear the hack, hack, hack of axes falling on the timber, although they could see that nothing yet, because there was a rise of ground in between them, in front of them, and they had reached the top of it. They could see the right and the left, and to the right was Lantern Waste itself, and the king's face turned white when he saw it. Right down the middle of the most ancient forest, that forest where the trees of gold and of silver had once grown, and where the child from our world had once planted the tree of protection, a broad lane had already been opened. It was a hideous lane, like a gash, raw gash in the land, full of muddy ruts that where felled trees had been dragged down to the river. There was a great crowd of people at work, and a cracking of whips and horses tugging and straining as they dragged it at their legs. The first thing that struck the king and the unicorn was that about half of the people in the crowd were not talking beasts, but men. The next thing that was, these men were not fair-haired men of Narnia. They were dark, bearded men from Colorman, and that great and cruel country that lies beyond Archenland across the desert to the south. There was no reason, of course, why one should not meet a color marine or two in Narnia, a merchant or an ambassador, for there was peace between Narnia and Colormen in those days, but Tyrion could not understand why there were so many of them, nor why they were cutting down a Narnian forest. He grasped his sword tighter and rolled his cloak around his left arm, and then they came quickly down among the men. 2 color marines were driving a horse, which was harnessed to a log. Just as the king reached them, the log got stuck in a bad, muddy place. "Go on, son of sloth! Pull, you lazy pig!" cried the color marines, cracking their whips. The horse was already straining himself as hard as he could, and his eyes were red and he was covered with foam. "Work, lazy brute!" shouted one of the color marines, and as he spoke, he struck the horse savagely with his whip. It was then when the really dreadful thing happened. Up till now, Tyrion had taken it for granted that the horses which the color marines were driving were their own horses, dumb, witless animals like the horses of our own world. And though he hated to see even a dumb horse overdriven, it was, of course, thinking more about the murder of the trees. It had never crossed his mind that anyone would dare to harness one of the free talking horses of Narnia, much less to use a whip on it. But as the savage blow fell across the horse's rear, reared up and said, half screaming, "Fool and tyrant, do you not see I'm doing all I can?" When Tyrion knew that the horse was one of his own Narnians, there came over him and over Jewel such a rage they did not know what they were doing. The king's sword went up, the unicorn's horn went down. They rushed forward together. Next moment, both the color marines lay dead. One beheaded by Tyrion's sword, and the other gored through by the heart of Jewel's horn. And that's the end of chapter 2.